All right, let me break this down step by step in simple and easy words so that you can understand it easily, just like a story. Big picture. Who was really in control of India? A long time ago, India was ruled by a company called the East India Company. But after a big violent event called the Revolt of 1857, the British government got very worried. They realized that the company's rule wasn't working well. The people of India were unhappy with the way things were being run. What happened after the Revolt of 1857? The British government in England decided to remove the East India Company from power and take direct control of India. This means that instead of the company controlling India, Queen Victoria and the British Crown would now run India directly. The Government of India Act, 1858. To make this official, the British Parliament passed a new law called the Government of India Act, 1858. This law said, the British Crown, or Queen, will now rule India. All the lands, money, and power that the company had in India would now be under the British government. A new leader, called the Secretary of State for India, would be appointed in England. This person would manage everything related to India from Britain. Queen Victoria's Proclamation. After this law was passed, Queen Victoria made an official announcement to the people of India. She said that from now on, the British Crown, herself, would be responsible for the government of India. She wanted to assure Indian princes and chiefs that their rights would be respected under her rule. To make sure everything ran smoothly, George, Lord Canning, was made the first Viceroy of India. The Viceroy was like a representative of the Queen, sent to India to rule on her behalf. Queen becomes Empress of India. Later on, in 1876, another big change happened. The British Parliament passed another law allowing the British monarch, the Queen, to take on the fancy new title of Empress of India, or Kaisar-i-Hind. A huge event called the Delhi Durbar was held in 1877, where it was announced that Queen Victoria was now the Empress of India. After this, it became common to call her the Queen Empress, or when there was a king, the King Emperor. Why did all this happen? The changes were not just about rules. They were about control. The British government realized that they needed to be stronger in how they ruled India because many countries, like America, Japan, and other European nations, were becoming powerful and competing for trade and control over colonies like India. There were also powerful business groups in Britain who wanted to make sure they could continue making money from India. So all these changes, like making India part of the British Crown's empire, were designed to ensure that the British control over India was strong and unshakable, like a rock of granite. All right, let's break this down in the simplest way, just like we did earlier. Imagine you're a kid learning about how a country, India, was managed from far away, Britain, step by step. The Secretary of State for Indian Affairs. Think of the Secretary of State as a very important person in Britain who was in charge of everything related to India. After the Government of India Act, 1858, this person became the main advisor to the Queen or King on all things about India. Basically, the Queen listened to this person when she had to make decisions about India. Who helped the Secretary of State? The Secretary of State didn't work alone. He had a team of 15 people, known as the India Council, to help him. These people were very experienced in Indian affairs. At first, they were appointed for life, but later, they were given terms of 10 to 15 years. This was to make sure that the Secretary had experts who understood India really well. What was the India Office? All the work related to India was done in a place called the India Office. It was like a huge office where all the decisions and paperwork about India were managed. Inside the India Office, there were different departments or sections, just like in a big company. Each department had its own specific job. For example, there were committees, and each had a secretary and an assistant secretary who were in charge of that section. There was also an accountant general who took care of all the money and payments. There were clerks, office workers, who handled all the paperwork and records. There was a registrar whose job was to keep track of all important documents and records. A superintendent of records made sure that all the important files and information were stored safely. There was even a director of funds who managed how money was invested and used. Other important people at the India office. Apart from the main departments, there were a few more important roles. A medical board to take care of health-related issues. A legal advisor and a solicitor, like lawyers, who gave legal advice to the Secretary of State. Who paid for all of this? Here's something important. All the people working at the India office, including the Secretary of State, his team, the clerks, and everyone else, were paid from India's money. This means the Indian government's revenues, money collected from taxes in India, were used to pay their salaries, pensions, and other costs. Example to make it clear. Think of the Secretary of State as the principal of a very big school, India. The India Council is like a group of teachers who help the principal make decisions. The India office is like the school's main office, where all the paperwork, records, and money matters are handled. Each part of the school office has its own job, like someone handling the school's budget, money, someone taking care of important documents, and someone else making sure everyone is paid. But here's the catch. All the money to run this school office is coming from the students' fees, India's taxes, not from the principal's pocket, the British government. Why does this matter? By putting this whole system in place, the British ensured that they could control India effectively from far away, Britain. They had experts managing everything, from laws to finances. But at the same time, they made sure India paid for all the costs of running this system. This setup helped Britain keep a tight grip on India without spending too much of their own money. Does that make it easier to understand? Feel free to ask if you need any part of this explained. Let's break this down step by step using the simplest language, just like you asked. The government of India after 1858. After the revolt of 1857, the British decided to change how India was ruled. But the Act of 1858 didn't bring big changes to how India was governed. One key change was that the Governor-General, the British official in charge of India, got a new name. He started being called the Viceroy. The Viceroy was basically the representative of the British Queen, or King, in India. This title didn't come from any law. It was mostly used in ceremonies or formal events to show that the Viceroy represented the Crown. For example, the Viceroy attended important functions and gatherings as the Crown's representative. But the actual work of ruling India didn't change much. The Viceroy's salary was fixed at 2.5 lakh rupees per year. The Viceroy's Council. The Viceroy didn't work alone. He had an executive council, a team of advisors, to help him make decisions. At first, there were 4 members on this council. In 1861, a 5th member was added. By 1874, there was permission to add a 6th member. However, this council was for advising the Viceroy only. When it came to making laws, legislative purposes, the Indian Council Act of 1861 allowed the Viceroy to expand his council to include more members, between 6 to 12 additional members. Later, the Indian Council Act of 1892 increased the number of these additional members to between 10 to 16. By the Indian Council Act of 1909, and later, with the Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935, the councils grew larger. But the real power always stayed with the Governor-General, Viceroy. This means that even though the council got bigger, the Viceroy still had all the control. The Secretary of State's power. Now let's talk about the relationship between the Secretary of State, the British official in charge of Indian affairs in Britain, and the Governor-General Viceroy in India. Even though the Viceroy was in India, the real control of Indian affairs was still with the Secretary of State back in Britain. The Secretary of State was often called the Grand Mughal, a title showing great power. He was the boss. In fact, the Secretary of State told Lord Mayo, a viceroy in India at the time, very clearly. The final control over India's affairs is with the British government, home government, not with the officials in India. This means that even though there were officials in India, like the viceroy and his council, real decisions were made in Britain. How communication improved control. By 1870, Britain laid a direct cable line between England and India. This was like a telephone or internet line of that time, allowing them to send messages faster. They also started using steam-powered ships and opened the Suez Canal, which made travel between Britain and India quicker. These changes allowed the Secretary of State to have even tighter control over what was happening in India. This meant that decisions could be made and communicated much faster, and Britain could keep a closer watch on Indian affairs. Economic control over India. Because all the real power was in Britain, it wasn't just the British government that benefited. British businesses, like industrialists, merchants, and bankers, also gained more control over India's economy. They had a big say in India's economic policies. This made sure that Britain could profit from India's wealth and resources. Was it still despotic rule? In reality, even after all these changes, the way India was governed remained like a despotism. Despotism is a type of rule where one group has all the power and controls everything. This wasn't by accident. The British had a clear policy that they would rule India with complete control. An example of this thinking comes from Charles Wood, a British politician, who said while discussing the Indian Council's Bill of 1861, "When one race rules over another, even the mildest form of rule is still a despotism." This means that no matter how much the British said they were governing fairly or gently, they still had absolute control over India. Simplified example to understand it better. Think of the British government as a remote-controlled robot, and India as the robot itself. The person holding the remote, Secretary of State in Britain, has all the control, and the robot, India's government, just follows orders. The viceroy is like the person sitting inside the robot, pushing buttons and pretending to control things. But in reality, the real power is with the person holding the remote in Britain. Even though some small changes were made inside the robot, like adding more council members, the person controlling the remote still has the final say in everything the robot does. Summary. The Governor-General of India was now called the Viceroy, a representative of the British Crown. The Viceroy's council grew, but the real power stayed with the Viceroy and, ultimately, the Secretary of State in Britain. Britain kept tight control over India, using fast communication and new technology like cable lines and steamships. The system allowed British businesses to profit from India. Even though the British said they were being fair, India was still ruled with absolute control, despotism. Does that make everything clear? Let me know if you want to dive deeper into any part of it. Let's break this down, step by step, into the simplest language. I'll explain what each part means and make it easy to understand. The Executive Council of the Governor-General. The Governor-General, who was later called the Viceroy, had a team of people to help him. This team was called the Executive Council. Think of it like a group of advisors who helped the Viceroy make decisions. Here's how the council changed over time. 1. At first, the Executive Council had 4 members. 2. In 1861, they added a 5th member. 3. In 1874, they allowed the appointment of a 6th member, but this didn't happen right away. The Indian Council Act of 1861. Now, the Indian Council Act of 1861 made an important change. This act allowed the Viceroy's Executive Council to grow larger for legislative purposes only. Let's break this down further. Legislative purposes means making laws. So the act said that for the purpose of making laws, the Viceroy could add more people to his council. The act allowed the Viceroy to add not less than 6 and not more than 12 additional members. This means the Viceroy had to add at least 6 new members, but he could add up to 12 members. These additional members didn't have as much power as the main council members, but they helped in the lawmaking process. The Indian Council Act of 1892. In 1892, the Indian Council Act made the council even bigger. This act increased the number of additional members. Now the viceroy could have at least 10 additional members, minimum, up to 16 additional members, maximum. This meant that the council was growing. But remember, these additional members only helped with making laws. They didn't have as much power as the viceroy or his core group of advisors. The Indian Councils Act of 1909. In 1909, another law was passed, the Indian Councils Act of 1909. This act allowed even more members to join the council. It was part of a slow process of giving Indians a little more say in how laws were made. But the real control still stayed with the British. The Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935. After that, two more important acts were passed. 1. The Government of India Act of 1919. 2. The Government of India Act of 1935. These acts also expanded the legislative councils, meaning they allowed even more people to join the council and be part of the lawmaking process. However, even though more people were allowed to be part of these councils, the real power still stayed with the Governor-General, Viceroy. The Governor-General, appointed by the British, was the one with the final say in decisions. So even though it looked like more Indians were involved in the councils, it didn't mean they had real control over the important decisions. The British government still had most of the power. The Executive Council of the Governor-General started with 4 members and slowly grew to have more members over time. The Indian Council Act of 1861 allowed the Viceroy to add 6 to 12 additional members to help with making laws. The Indian Council Act of 1892 allowed even more additional members, between 10 to 16. The Indian Councils Act of 1909 and the Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935 expanded these councils further. But the real power always remained with the Governor-General Viceroy, and ultimately with the British government. Think of it like this. Imagine a school where the principal makes all the rules. Over time, the principal allows more teachers to join meetings and share their ideas. But in the end, the principal is the one who makes the final decisions. The teachers can talk and suggest things, but the real power stays with the principal. In this case, the viceroy is like the principal, and the additional council members are like the teachers. Does this help explain it better? Let me know if you need more clarification. Let me explain the reorganization of the army after the revolt of 1857 in the simplest way, step by step, like teaching a beginner. Why was the army reorganized? 1. The revolt of 1857. In 1857, many Indian soldiers called sepoys in the British Army revolted against the British in India. This revolt started in a place called Meerut on 10th May 1857. This event shook the British rule in India because the British realized their control over the army was weak, especially in the Bengal army, which was mostly Indian soldiers. The British saw that the Indian soldiers were united, brotherhood, and that made it easier for them to revolt together. 2. What did the British do? After the revolt, the British knew they needed to change, reorganize the army to prevent another large rebellion. They wanted to make sure that Indian soldiers could not unite in large numbers again against the British. Key changes made in the army. 1. Mixing the European, British, and Indian forces. Before 1857, there was a separate army for the East India Company, the British company that ruled parts of India. After the revolt, the British combined the East India Company's army with the army of the British Crown, the Queen, King of England. This way, the British had more control over the Indian soldiers. 2. More European soldiers. Before 1857, there were about 45,000 British soldiers in India. After the revolt, the British increased the number of British soldiers to 65,000. At the same time, they reduced the number of Indian soldiers from 238,000 to 140,000. This was to make sure the British soldiers, Europeans, outnumbered the Indian soldiers, or at least could control them. 3. Ratio of European to Indian soldiers. In the Bengal army, for every 1 British soldier, there would be 2 Indian soldiers. In Bombay and Madras, other regions, for every 1 British soldier, there would be 3 Indian soldiers. This means that the British wanted to have more control by having enough British soldiers compared to Indian soldiers. 4. Martial and non-martial races. The British created a system where they favored certain races, groups of people, as better fighters. Soldiers from places like the Punjab, Nepal, north and northwest of India were called martial races. The British thought they were braver and stronger. These soldiers were recruited in large numbers. Other groups, which the British didn't consider as strong, were not recruited as much. Example. It's like a football coach picking only certain players who they think are stronger and faster, and not choosing others, even if they are also good. 5. Regional loyalties. The British also encouraged regional loyalties, which means they made soldiers feel more connected to their region, local area, rather than the country. This was to prevent Indian soldiers from uniting as one country and fighting against the British. They didn't want another big national rebellion like the Revolt of 1857. Costs of the Army reorganization. 1. More money spent on the Army. After reorganizing the Army, the defense expenses increased. A lot of the money collected from Indian taxes was spent on the Army. About 25 to 30% of the total revenue, money collected by the government, was spent on the Army. This was a huge amount of money, and most of it was not used for the benefit of the Indian people, but for the British Empire. 2. Comparison with other British colonies. A report in 1908 said that Britain spent 22% of its money on defense. British dominions, self-governing areas like Australia and Canada, spent 3 cents. British colonies, smaller places under British rule, spent 4%. India had to spend a huge 33% of its money on the army. Example, imagine you live in a house where you have to spend 33% of your income on protecting someone else's property, but you don't get much benefit yourself. That's what happened to India. Purpose of the reorganized army. 1. 2 main reasons for the army. The British used the Indian army for 2 purposes. Defending India's borders, keeping invaders away, expanding and protecting the British Empire in other parts of the world. For example, they sent Indian soldiers to fight in places like Crimea, China, and New Zealand. Conclusion. The reorganization of the army was a major step taken by the British after the Revolt of 1857. The main goal was to prevent another large rebellion by making sure Indian soldiers were not united, increase the number of British soldiers in India, use the Indian army to help the British in wars around the world. While this may have made the British feel more secure, it also meant that a large portion of India's money was being spent to support British interests, not for the benefit of the Indian people. The British wanted to stay in control and used the army to ensure their empire stayed strong. Does that make it easier to understand? Let me know if you need any more examples or if you want me anything further.
Let me break down administrative decentralization in the simplest way possible, step by step, to make it easy to understand, as if teaching a beginner. What is administrative decentralization? Administrative decentralization means giving more power to local governments, like provinces or states, so they can make decisions and handle things on their own, rather than the central government, the top, controlling everything. The British first tried to centralize power, meaning they wanted the governor general to have control over all the decisions across India. Later, they changed their approach and began to decentralize, meaning they started giving back some powers to the provinces, like Bombay, Madras, Bengal. The Charter Act of 1833. Centralization before 1833. Provinces like Bombay and Madras had some powers to make their own laws. The Charter Act of 1833. This law made by the British Parliament in 1833 took away the power to make laws from provinces like Bombay and Madras. Now, only the Governor-General, the head of British rule in India, and his council had the power to make laws. Provinces could only suggest ideas for new laws, but they couldn't make them. Example: imagine your school principal makes all the rules for every classroom. Your class teacher can only suggest some ideas but can't decide on rules for the classroom. Indian Councils Act of 1861. Decentralization begins. What changed in 1861? The Indian Councils Act of 1861 was passed, which began to give back some lawmaking powers to the provinces. Now, provinces like Bombay and Madras could make some of their own laws again, but for some important matters, they still needed the Governor-General's approval. Example: imagine your class teacher now gets to make some rules for your class, but for important decisions, they still need the principal's approval. New legislative councils. The British set up legislative councils, groups that helped make laws in different provinces. Bengal and Bombay in 1862. Uttar Pradesh, UP, in 1886. Punjab in 1894. Western Bengal and Assam in 1905. These councils helped provinces have some control over local laws. Example: it's like each classroom having a group of students and teachers that help decide rules for their own class. Indian Councils Act of 1892 and 1909. More powers to provinces. Indian Councils Act of 1892. This law gave more powers to the provincial legislative councils. It allowed them to discuss financial matters and ask questions about the government's budget. How money is spent? Indian Councils Act of 1909. This law allowed Indians to become members of these councils. This was another step toward giving provinces more control over their own affairs. Example: now, not only do the teachers make some class rules, but students can also join the council and discuss how money is spent in the school. Government of India Act of 1919. Diarchy. What is diarchy? The Government of India Act of 1919 introduced something called diarchy in the provinces. This means the government's responsibilities were divided into two parts: transferred subjects. These were subjects, areas of work, like health, education, and agriculture, which were handled by Indian ministers. Reserve subjects. These were important subjects like the police and army, which were still controlled by the British governor. Example: imagine your class teacher lets some students take care of cleaning and organizing the class, but the teacher still controls things like security and discipline. Government of India Act of 1935. Provincial autonomy. What changed in 1935? The Government of India Act of 1935 gave provinces even more freedom. They could now handle almost all their affairs on their own without needing to take permission from the central government, Governor-General, for every little thing. This was called provincial autonomy, where provinces became almost independent in making their own decisions. Example: now your class teacher has the full freedom to make all the class rules without needing the principal's approval. Financial decentralization. Lord Mayo's policy. 1870s. The British realized that provinces should also have control over money, finance. So Lord Mayo, a British leader, started the policy of financial decentralization. This means provinces were allowed to collect and spend money on certain services like excise, tax on goods, land revenue reforms, law, and justice. Example: your class teacher is now allowed to collect and spend money on things like new books, pencils, and class decorations. Divided heads. 1882 and 1882. A new system called divided heads was introduced. This means the money collected from things like excise, stamps, and forest was shared between the central government and the provinces. Provinces were no longer given fixed grants but could now earn money directly from certain areas. Example: your class can now earn money by selling lemonade, excise, and divide that money between the class, province, and the school, central government. Government of India Act of 1919. This act modified the financial system again to give provinces even more financial independence. Summary of administrative decentralization. At first, the British wanted all the power to be in the hands of the central government, Governor-General. Later, they realized it's better to give some power back to the provinces, so they could make their own laws and manage their own finances. Over time, through various acts, laws, like the Indian Councils Act of 1861, 1892, 1909, and the Government of India Acts of 1919 and 1935, provinces got more and more freedom to make laws and handle their own finances. The process started with small steps, like giving back some legislative powers, and ended with full provincial autonomy in 1935, where provinces could handle almost everything on their own. Let me know if you need any part of this to be explained in more detail, or if you want further examples. 1. British control and economic exploitation. Who controlled India? The British controlled India during the time of the British Crown. They were mainly interested in using India's resources to benefit their own country, Great Britain. What was their goal? The British wanted to make as much money as possible from India. They took resources like raw materials, cotton, spices, tea, etc., and made profits by selling them in other markets, mostly in Europe. 2. Drain of wealth. What is the drain of wealth? The drain of wealth means that the British were taking wealth, money, resources, goods from India and sending it to their own country. India was losing money while Britain was getting richer. How did this change over time? At first, under the East India Company, before British Crown rule, India's wealth was being drained using mercantilist policies, where trade was controlled to favor the British. Later, under the British Crown, this wealth drain continued but changed its form. Instead of just controlling trade, they opened up India to free trade, meaning British goods could be sold in India easily. India had to buy more from Britain, even though it hurt local Indian industries. 3. Free trade and British goods. What is free trade? Free trade means there are no restrictions or extra taxes on goods being imported into a country. The British forced India to accept free trade, meaning Indian markets were flooded with British goods. What was the result of free trade? Indian businesses could not compete with British factories. Many Indian industries, especially handloom, local weaving, suffered because British products were cheaper and more abundant. 4. British finance capitalism. What is finance capitalism? Finance capitalism means that British money, capital, came into India to set up industries, railways, plantations like tea, coffee, and mining, coal and iron. They called it modernization, but really, it was to benefit British companies. Who benefited? British companies and businessmen profited the most. They controlled the factories, mines, and plantations. Indian workers were employed but paid very little. 5. Railways, ports, and plantations. Why were railways built? The British built railways mainly to transport goods, like cotton, jute, tea, from India's interior to the ports so they could be shipped to Britain. It also helped move British products into rural parts of India, expanding their market. What about plantations? The British focused on large-scale farming for things like tea, coffee, and indigo, a dye. They sold these crops in Europe, making huge profits, but Indian farmers didn't benefit much. 6. The impact on Indian society. What happened to farmers? Agricultural class? The British policies caused problems in Indian agriculture. The land tenure system, who owns the land, created two groups. Zamindars, landowners. They became richer but often collected high taxes from farmers. Tenants/farmers. They had to pay high rents and taxes, pushing many into poverty. Farmers were also forced to grow cash crops, like indigo and cotton, instead of food crops, which sometimes caused famines because there wasn't enough food. What about workers in cities? Industrial class? Factory workers were not paid well, had long working hours, and even children were forced to work. There was no protection for them. Later, workers formed trade unions like the All India Trade Union Congress, ATUC, to fight for better conditions. But they didn't have much power in the beginning. 7. The middle class. What happened to educated Indians? Even educated Indians, middle class, faced problems. They were discriminated against in higher jobs like civil services or military positions. British officials got the best jobs, and Indians were left with lower-paying positions. 8. British racial bias. How did the British treat Indians? The British believed that Indians were not capable of running their own country. This was racial discrimination. Even when Indians were educated and skilled, they were kept out of important government roles. 9. Criticism of British policies. Who criticized the British? Many Indian leaders, like Dadabhai Naoroji, M.G. Ranade, and R.C. Dutt, strongly opposed British policies. They said that British rule was causing India to become poorer and that India's wealth was being drained away. What did they write? Dadabhai Naoroji wrote a famous book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, where he explained how British policies were making India poor. He said Britain was bleeding India white, meaning they were taking all the wealth and leaving India with almost nothing. 10. The need for freedom. What was the solution? Indian leaders realized that the only way to improve India's economy was to get rid of British control. Jawaharlal Nehru, who later became India's first prime minister, said that British and Indian economic interests were in conflict, meaning the two could not prosper together. India needed freedom to manage its own resources and wealth. Example to simplify: imagine if you owned a garden full of fruit trees. A powerful neighbor comes and takes over your garden. They take most of the fruit to sell in their own market, leaving you with very little to eat. They say they are helping by planting new trees. But these trees only grow fruits they like, which they sell for themselves. You work in the garden, but get very little in return. This is similar to what Britain did in India. Summary: the British exploited India's economy for their own benefit. They drained India's wealth, making India poorer. They forced India to open its markets to British goods, hurting Indian industries. British money was invested in railways and plantations, but this mostly helped British companies. Indian farmers, workers, and even the educated middle class suffered under British rule. Indian leaders criticized British policies and realized that India needed independence to improve its economy. By understanding these points, it becomes clear that British rule in India was focused on using India's resources to benefit Britain while leaving India impoverished.
Let's simplify the history of civil services in India under British rule. I will explain it in the simplest way possible. 1. What is civil services? Civil services are jobs in the government. People who pass the civil service exam get these jobs. They help run the country by doing important work like collecting taxes, managing public works, and keeping law and order. 2. What did Lord Cornwallis do? Lord Cornwallis was a British governor in India. He started giving important government jobs, higher services, to Europeans, British people only. He didn't allow Indians to have these jobs, which created inequality. 3. Charter Act of 1833. This law, Charter Act of 1833, had a rule that said no Indian should be stopped from getting a job in the Indian Civil Services, ICS, just because of their religion, birthplace, family background, or skin color. But in reality, no Indian was given a job in the ICS. They made rules that were impossible for most Indians to follow. 4. Competitive exams for civil services. 1853. In 1853, the British government passed a new rule that said anyone could apply for civil service jobs by passing a tough exam. The first exam was held in 1855. But even though the exam was open to Indians, very few Indians could pass. This was because of many difficulties they had to face. 5. Problems for Indians in civil services. A. Exam only in London. The ICS exam was held only in London, England. Indians had to travel far away to take the exam, which was very expensive and hard for most Indians. B. Syllabus not suited for Indians. The subjects of the exam included Greek, Latin, and English, which were languages that English students learned, but most Indians didn't. This made it much harder for Indians to pass. C. Age limit problems. At first, the maximum age limit to take the exam was 23 years. Then it was lowered to 22 in 1860, 21 in 1866, and then 19 years. This made it nearly impossible for Indians to qualify. Most Indians couldn't finish their education early enough to take the exam. After a lot of protests by Indian leaders, the age limit was changed to 22 to 24 years in 1906, but it was still a struggle for many. 6. Discrimination in other jobs. Not only were higher civil services jobs hard for Indians to get, but even in lower government jobs, there was discrimination. For example, in many services like Survey of India, Salt Department, Excise Department, and Post Office, there were two sets of rules for hiring people. Anglo-Indians, people of mixed British and Indian ancestry, or Europeans. They needed lower qualifications, less education. Indians, they needed higher qualifications, more education. In some government departments like railways, telegraph, and public works, most jobs were given to Anglo-Indians and Europeans, even though Indians were equally qualified. Example to simplify. Imagine there's a school competition where everyone is allowed to participate, but the competition is held in a different city that is far away and hard to reach. The test questions are in a foreign language that only some students know well. The rules keep changing to make it even harder, like saying only younger students can participate. This is similar to what happened with civil services. Indians were technically allowed, but they faced so many barriers that it was nearly impossible for them to succeed. Mot 7. What changed later? Indian leaders protested and raised their voices against these unfair policies. After India gained independence in 1947, the civil services became fairer, and Indians could freely take the exams without facing these obstacles. Lord Cornwallis started giving higher government jobs only to Europeans. The Charter Act of 1833 said Indians couldn't be denied jobs because of their religion or birthplace. But this didn't happen in practice. In 1853, the civil services exam was open to Indians, but there were too many difficulties, like the exam being held only in London, an unfair syllabus, and an age limit that was too low. Indians were discriminated against in both higher and lower government jobs. Only after a lot of protests by Indian leaders did things start to improve for Indians, especially after India became independent. Now, civil services in India are based on merit, and anyone can apply and qualify by passing the exam without facing the same problems that existed during British rule. Let me explain this in the simplest way, step by step. 1. Who were the princely states? Princely states were parts of India ruled by Indian kings or princes. These states were not directly controlled by the British, but were still under British influence. 2. What happened during the revolt of 1857? In 1857, many Indians fought against the British, which is known as the Revolt of 1857. The Indian princes, mostly, supported the British during the revolt. This was important because the British needed help to stay in power. Lord Canning, a British official, said that if one of the powerful princes like Scindia from Gwalior joined the revolt, the British would have to leave India. This shows how much they relied on these princes for support. 3. British rewards to the princes. After the revolt of 1857, the British realized that these princes could help them keep control of India. So, they made sure the princes stayed loyal by making promises. In 1858, Queen Victoria of Britain said she would respect the rights and dignity of the Indian princes. This meant the British would not take away their power or states as long as they helped the British rule India. 4. Change in British policy. Earlier, the British had a policy called the Doctrine of Lapse. This allowed them to take over a state if a ruler didn't have a male heir or mismanaged the state. But after 1857, they stopped this policy. From now on, if a prince was mismanaging his state, the British would remove him, but they wouldn't take over the state. For example, in 1874, a prince named Malhar Rao Gaikwad was accused of trying to poison a British official. He was removed from power, but the state wasn't taken over. Instead, another member of his family was put on the throne. 5. British control over princes. Even though the princes were allowed to keep their states, the British made sure they had complete control over them. In 1862, Lord Canning made it clear that the British Crown was the most powerful authority in India, and all the princes were under its control. The British also gave special permissions to the princes to allow them to adopt heirs. These permissions were called sanads. In 1876, Queen Victoria took the title of Empress of India. This showed that the British ruled both British-ruled India and princely India. A rule passed in 1891 officially stated that the Indian princes were subordinate to the British Crown. 6. How the British interfered in the princes' states. The princes were allowed to rule their states, but the British still controlled important things. For example, the British decided how railways, canals, and telegraphs would be built in the princely states. The British also controlled ceremonial matters, like deciding how much respect each prince would get. The princes were not allowed to deal with foreign countries on their own, and their trips abroad were even controlled by the British, especially under Lord Curzon. 7. Princes during World Wars. During World War I and World War II, the Indian princes supported the British by giving them resources like money and soldiers. 8. The end of British rule and the fate of the princes. As India's freedom movement gained strength, the British used the princes to try to counter the demands of Indian nationalists. However, when the British decided to leave India, they announced that the British paramountcy over the princely states would end. This was stated in Prime Minister Attlee's announcement in 1947 and the Mountbatten Plan of 1947. The Indian princes were then left to decide whether to join India or Pakistan, as the British would no longer protect them. Simple example. Imagine a big playground where different kids have their own areas, like princely states. A group of kids, the British, comes in and says, "You can keep your areas, but you must listen to us." If a kid helps the group during a fight, like in the 1857 revolt, they are rewarded by being allowed to keep their area. But the group still controls important things, like where the swings or slides, railways, telegraphs will go. Finally, when the group decides to leave the playground, they tell the kids, "Now you're on your own. You can join another group, India or Pakistan, or try to stay independent." Key points to remember. Indian princes helped the British during the 1857 revolt. After 1857, the British promised not to take away the states of the princes, but made sure they controlled everything important. By 1947, when the British left India, had to decide their future in independent India or Pakistan.